Technical trainer Sarah Mitchell had been with Blackstone Security Academy for 3 years. And in those 3 years, she'd mastered the art of being invisible. Not in the way that reconnaissance specialists melted into shadows, but in the deliberate way former special operations personnel learned to blend into civilian life when their past was too dangerous to reveal. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. She arrived at the Academy training facility at 0500 hours every morning, 2 hours before the first instructor briefing, and often remained until well past midnight, perfecting lesson plans and equipment maintenance protocols that kept the entire tactical training program operational. Her workstation was nestled in the corner of the instructor preparation room, surrounded by equipment manuals, training schedules, and the constant hum of a private security academy that never truly slept out at 29. Sarah possessed the kind of methodical precision that military-style training programs depended on but rarely celebrated. She could recite ammunition specifications for every weapon system in their inventory, coordinate complex multi-team exercises under impossible time constraints, and anticipate equipment failures before they occurred. When lead instructors needed emergency equipment replacements during live-fire exercises, Sarah could orchestrate the delivery down to the minute. When communications failed between training sectors, she already had backup systems deploying before most supervisors realized there was a problem. But what nobody knew, what Sarah carefully concealed beneath long-sleeved instructor uniforms and professional demeanor, was the intricate tattoo work that covered both her arms from wrist to shoulder. Not the typical military ink that most veterans displayed with pride, but specialized markings that told a story too classified for civilian consumption. The Ranger tab outline on her left forearm, filled with coordinates from a mission that officially never happened. The JSOC lightning bolt on her right bicep, surrounded by call signs of operators who died in places the public would never hear about. Most telling of all, the small trident nestled between her shoulder blades, marking her as one of the few women to complete the most classified training pipeline in the military. Every morning, Sarah stood before her bathroom mirror, carefully applying concealer to any exposed skin, then pulling on long-sleeved compression shirts that she wore beneath her academy uniform. The Virginia heat made this routine nearly unbearable during summer months, but the alternative was exposure of a past that would raise questions she couldn't answer. During her 3 years at Blackstone, Sarah had systematically studied every aspect of their training protocols, identifying inefficiencies and potential improvements that came from her unique perspective. While other instructors followed standardized curricula developed by former law enforcement officers, Sarah recognized tactical gaps that could prove fatal in real-world scenarios. She'd submitted dozens of recommendations through proper channels, suggesting modifications to close-quarters battle training, improvements to team movement protocols, and enhanced stress inoculation exercises. None of her suggestions had been implemented. The problem wasn't the quality of her recommendations. The problem was the source. Sarah Mitchell, as far as anyone at Blackstone knew, was a former Army logistics specialist who'd transitioned to civilian training after a single deployment to a quiet sector in Afghanistan. Her official records, carefully sanitized through channels she'd never discuss, showed a competent but unremarkable military career focused on supply chain management and equipment maintenance. The truth was significantly more complex. Sarah had spent 7 years in the most classified units of the military, participating in operations that ranged from counter-terrorism to direct action missions across 4 continents. She'd earned her Ranger tab during a deployment to Africa that involved hunting high-value targets through hostile territory. The JSOC assignment had taken her to places that didn't exist on any public map, working with teams that operated beyond CONVENTIONL military oversight. The trident represented the culmination of a training pipeline so exclusive that fewer than 50 women had ever attempted it, and fewer than 10 had succeeded. But that life had ended abruptly when a mission in Eastern Europe went sideways, resulting in casualties that couldn't be explained and operations that couldn't be acknowledged. Sarah had been offered two choices: accept a medal she could never display and assignment to a training facility where her experience would be wasted, or leave the military entirely with a sanitized record and start over in the civilian world. She'd chosen to start over. The irony wasn't lost on her. Here at Blackstone, surrounded by instructors who'd served honorably but conventionally, she was treated as a junior trainer whose input was rarely sought and seldom valued. Former police officers dominated the academy's hierarchy, their civilian law enforcement experience viewed as more relevant to private security training than military background. The few military veterans on staff were infantry soldiers or military police officers whose service, while respected, had been conducted in conventional units with transparent operational records. Sarah's direct supervisor, Director James Hawthorne, was a former SWAT commander who'd built Blackstone's reputation on practical law enforcement training. His approach emphasized de-escalation techniques, constitutional law compliance, and urban tactical procedures designed for civilian protection services. His methods were effective for their intended purpose, but Sarah recognized critical gaps. In the curriculum, modern threats required responses that went beyond traditional law enforcement tactics. The private security industry was increasingly asked to operate in environments that resembled military battlefields more than civilian law enforcement scenarios. Corporate executives needed protection in hostile foreign countries. Diplomatic facilities required security teams capable of responding to coordinated attacks, and high-value clients demanded bodyguards who could function effectively in austere environments. But when Sarah attempted to introduce advanced tactical concepts during instructor meetings, her suggestions were politely dismissed. Hawthorne's standard response was that their students needed practical skills for civilian environments, not military fantasies that had no application in the real world. The other instructors, while professional in their interactions with her, clearly viewed her as someone whose military experience had been limited to rear echelon support functions. This morning began like countless others before it. Sarah was analyzing student performance data from the previous week's exercises when Hawthorne entered the preparation room, his polished shoes clicking on the recently mopped floor. Behind him followed his usual entourage: Assistant Director Rebecca Walsh, a former federal agent who'd arrived 6 months ago with impressive credentials and an immediate position in the academy's leadership structure, and senior instructor David Reynolds, Hawthorne's preferred tactical officer who seemingly could do no wrong. "Mitchell," Hawthorne called out, not bothering to approach her station. "We need those equipment maintenance reports for tomorrow's board review by 1300 hours. Think you can handle that? Or should I reassign it to someone with actual program oversight experience?" Sarah looked up from her monitor, her expression professionally neutral, despite the familiar sting of his words. The reports were completed. "At 0600, sir. They've been uploaded to the secure server with hard copies placed in your review folder. I've included projected replacement timelines for aging equipment and identified potential cost savings through alternative procurement." "Sources," Walsh smirked visibly. "Always trying to expand beyond your assigned duties," she muttered loudly enough for Sarah to hear. "Actually," Sarah continued, maintaining her composure, "I noticed a potential safety concern with the current training rotation for tomorrow's advanced tactical course. The ammunition allocation for the stress fire exercise exceeds recommended safety margins for the confined space we're using. If we adjust the course layout or modify the ammunition quantities, we can maintain training effectiveness while ensuring proper safety protocols." Hawthorne's jaw tightened noticeably. He didn't appreciate being corrected, especially not by a former logistics specialist who'd never led tactical operations in a real-world environment. I'll be the judge of what requires adjustment, Mitchell. Just stick to your equipment reports and leave program design to instructors who've actually planned tactical operations. Sarah saved her work and stood up, retrieving a folder from her filing cabinet. She placed it on her desk and opened it deliberately. Sir, I've cross-referenced recent training incident reports from similar academies with our current protocols. The data suggests a significant probability of— Enough, Mitchell. Hawthorne's voice cut through the preparation room like a whip crack. You're a logistics instructor, not a tactical operations planner. You maintain equipment and coordinate. Supplies. You don't make assessments about training protocols designed by people who've actually conducted tactical operations in the field. That's why you're assigned to equipment management instead of leading courses with real tactical applications. The preparation room fell silent except for the steady hum of computer equipment and the distant sounds of morning exercises beginning outside. Reynolds shifted his weight uncomfortably, and even Walsh seemed to sense that something fundamental had shifted in the atmosphere. Sarah closed the folder slowly, her fingers steady despite the heat rising in her face. Inside were copies of every qualification she'd ever earned, every classified training program she'd completed during her military service. Also tucked away were letters of recommendation from officers whose names appeared on no public roster, commendations for actions that had never been officially acknowledged, and training certificates for programs that didn't officially exist. Understood. Sir, she said quietly. As Hawthorne and his followers left, Sarah remained standing at her desk, staring at the closed folder. The equipment maintenance reports he'd dismissed represented hundreds of hours of analysis, identifying inefficiencies. That could save the Academy thousands of dollars while improving training effectiveness. The safety concerns she'd raised were based on experience with live-fire exercises, conducted under far more challenging conditions than Blackstone's controlled environment. But her real qualifications remained hidden beneath carefully applied concealer and long sleeves, invisible to people who'd already decided what she was capable of, based on the sanitized version of her military service. Sarah had been invisible for 3 years, but invisibility came with unexpected advantages. People didn't notice when you stayed after hours to review classified tactical publications that arrived through unofficial channels. They didn't question why you volunteered for every advanced training opportunity that came through professional networks, and they certainly didn't expect you to have connections that extended far beyond the private security training community. She sat back down at her station and reopened the student performance data. Then, almost as an afterthought, she opened a secure communication application on her personal device and began typing a message to Colonel Patricia Hayes, a former commanding officer whose current assignment was classified, but whose influence extended throughout both military and civilian tactical training communities. The subject line read, "Assessment complete, ready for transition." Sarah had spent 3 years learning to be invisible within the civilian security training system. Now it was time to show them exactly what they'd been overlooking. The ink beneath her sleeves told a story of capabilities that went far beyond equipment maintenance and logistics coordination. Soon, everyone at Blackstone would understand that true tactical expertise didn't oust itself with credentials and position titles. Sometimes it hid in plain sight, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. 3 days after the confrontation in the preparation room, Sarah arrived at work to find her instructor access credentials had been mysteriously downgraded. She stood at the entrance to the advanced tactical training section, watching as her keycard triggered a red denial light on the electronic scanner. A line of senior instructors waited behind her, their morning briefings delayed as she repeatedly swiped the card that had worked flawlessly for 3 years. "Having problems, Mitchell?" Assistant Director Walsh appeared beside her, satisfaction evident in her tone. "Maybe you should try the general equipment storage area. You know, where The logistics personnel belong. Sarah stepped aside, allowing Walsh to swipe her own credentials. The door unlocked immediately with an affirmative beep. There must be a system error, Sarah said evenly. I'll check with the security office. Oh, there's no error, Walsh replied, holding the door open but pointedly blocking Sarah's path. Director Hawthorne implemented new security protocols yesterday. Apparently, there were concerns about non-essential personnel accessing sensitive training information. The instructors waiting behind them exchanged uncomfortable glances. Master Instructor Carlos Rivera, a 20-year Marine veteran who had worked with Sarah on countless equipment coordination projects, stepped forward. Ma'am, with respect, Instructor Mitchell has clearance for this area. She coordinates all our equipment staging and has been integral to our advanced programs. Rivera. Walsh interrupted sharply. Take it up with the director if you have issues with proper security measures. Sarah watched Walsh disappear into the restricted area, then turned to Rivera. It's fine, Carlos. I'll sort this out. But as Sarah walked across the academy grounds toward the administration building, she noticed other changes. The access codes to the specialized equipment storage facilities had been changed without notification. Her regular workstation in the instructor preparation room had been reassigned to a junior training assistant. Her name had been removed from the tactical equipment maintenance rotation, posted in the main corridor in the administration office. Sarah found herself sitting across from Deputy Director Mark Foster, the Academy's personnel coordinator. Foster looked distinctly uncomfortable as he reviewed her file on his tablet. I'm sorry, Instructor Mitchell. The access restriction came directly from Director Hawthorne. He cited operational security concerns. Mark, I've maintained confidential clearance for 3 years without incident. My record is spotless. What specific security concern triggered this action? Foster consulted his notes, avoiding her gaze. He didn't specify details, but he did mention that your recent behavior has been concerning. Apparently, you've been overstepping your assigned duties and attempting to influence training decisions beyond your area of expertise. Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach. What decisions? Foster read from his screen. Questioning. Established training protocols. Attempting to override safety assessments made by qualified tactical instructors. Challenging command decisions in front of subordinate staff. He looked up at her with what might have been sympathy. Look, Sarah, I've known you since you started at Blackstone. This doesn't sound like you. But Hawthorne is building a case that you're becoming disruptive to program effectiveness. Disruptive? For doing my job? For attempting to do more than your job, Foster corrected. For acting like you're qualified to make tactical training decisions that are above your position and experience level. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, but the message was unmistakable. Stay in your designated role or face more severe consequences. Sarah left the administration building with her basic access temporarily restored, but understanding clearly that she was now under scrutiny that went far beyond normal performance evaluation. Director Hawthorne's background made him particularly resistant to input from military veterans, especially those whose service didn't align with his vision of practical law enforcement training. A former SWAT commander with the Baltimore Police Department, Hawthorne had built his reputation on urban tactical operations that emphasized controlled escalation and constitutional compliance. His transition to private security training had been motivated by frustration with military contractors who brought what he considered overseas combat mentality to domestic security operations. Hawthorne believed strongly that private security required a fundamentally different approach than military operations, where military training emphasized overwhelming force and mission accomplishment, regardless of collateral considerations. Civilian security demanded restraint, legal compliance, and protection of non-combatants. In his view, veterans who'd served in combat roles often struggled to adapt their mindset to civilian operational requirements. This philosophy extended throughout Blackstone's training methodology. The Academy's curriculum emphasized de-escalation, techniques, legal liability awareness, and protective procedures designed for corporate environments. Advanced tactical training focused on defensive protocols rather than aggressive intervention. Students learn to establish security perimeters, coordinate with local law enforcement, and protect clients through position and preparation rather than direct action. Sarah's military background, as far as Hawthorne knew, consisted of logistics and supply chain management, supposedly making her qualified for equipment coordination, but not tactical training design. Her suggestions for more aggressive training protocols, enhanced stress inoculation, and advanced weapons handling seemed to confirm his suspicions about military veterans who couldn't adapt to civilian requirements. What Hawthorne didn't understand was that Sarah's actual experience included extensive training in civilian protection protocols, hostage rescue operations, and low-visibility security operations designed specifically for sensitive environments. Her classified assignments had often involved protecting high-value individuals in hostile territories where excessive force would compromise operational objectives. She understood the balance between capability and restraint better than most law enforcement veterans, but she couldn't explain this without revealing information that remained classified. Assistant Director Walsh had become Hawthorne's primary ally in restricting Sarah's influence within the Academy. A former FBI counterterrorism agent, Walsh brought impressive credentials and strong opinions about proper training methodologies. Her federal law enforcement background gave her credibility that Sarah's sanitized military record couldn't match, and her arrival at Blackstone had coincided with increased scrutiny of military-influenced training protocols. Walsh viewed Sarah's suggestions as symptomatic of a broader problem within the private security industry. Military veterans who couldn't distinguish between battlefield tactics and civilian protection requirements. In her experience, veterans often proposed solutions that were tactically sound but legally problematic, operationally excessive, or culturally inappropriate for civilian environments. The restriction of Sarah's access wasn't arbitrary harassment. It reflected a systematic effort to limit military influence on training programs that Hawthorne and Walsh believed should emphasize civilian law enforcement principles. From their perspective, Sarah represented a category of instructor whose combat experience was more liability than asset in their training environment. Senior Instructor Reynolds had initially been neutral regarding Sarah's role at the Academy, but Hawthorne's increasing criticism had influenced his perspective. A former Army military police officer with deployment experience in Iraq, Reynolds understood military operations but agreed with Hawthorne that civilian security required different approaches. His own transition from military to civilian law enforcement had required significant adaptation, and he was sympathetic to concerns about military veterans who couldn't make similar adjustments. Reynolds had observed Sarah's equipment, maintenance work, and found it competent but unremarkable. Her suggestions for training modifications seemed ambitious but potentially problematic, especially her emphasis on more aggressive tactics and enhanced stress training. Without understanding her actual qualifications, he interpreted her recommendations as evidence of someone whose military experience had been limited, but whose aspirations exceeded her capabilities. That evening, Sarah stayed late again, but this time she wasn't alone. Master Instructor Rivera found her in the nearly empty equipment storage facility at 2,100 hours, conducting inventory checks that had been scheduled for the following week. "Mitchell, what's really happening here?" Rivera asked, settling into a chair beside her workstation. "Hawthorne has been asking questions about your work patterns, your access history, even your training recommendations. I've never seen him target someone like this. I think he wants me gone, Carlos." "Why?" "You're the most efficient logistics coordinator this academy has had." Half our successful training exercises in the past year wouldn't have happened without your equipment coordination. Sarah studied Rivera carefully. He represented the practical side of military training, someone who valued competence over politics and results over appearances. Can I ask you something off the record? Shoot. If someone hypothetically had extensive tactical qualifications, advanced training, operational experience, specialized certifications, but was restricted from training assignments because of administrative concerns or institutional bias, what would you advise them to do? Rivera said nothing for a long moment, carefully organizing his thoughts. Hypothetically, I'd say that person should remember that the private security industry is bigger than any one academy and bigger than any one director's opinion. Sometimes you have to navigate around obstacles instead of confronting them directly, even if it means abandoning a position you've worked years to build. Sarah, Rivera's voice softened, some people are meant to be in the field, whether or not their current assignment reflects that reality. And some institutions need to be challenged, even if the challenger pays a personal price. After Rivera left, Sarah opened her secure tablet and composed a message to Colonel Hayes. Situation accelerating. Request immediate consultation regarding transition options. The response arrived within 40 minutes. Consultation confirmed. Meet at designated location, Saturday 0800. New opportunities available for qualified personnel. Sarah printed the message, folded it carefully, and tucked it into her pocket. Tomorrow she would continue performing her assigned duties with professional competence, but she was also taking steps to document the systematic restriction of her capabilities and the waste of resources that resulted from Hawthorne's institutional bias. The equipment storage facility around her contained millions of dollars worth of tactical training equipment, much of it underutilized because the academy's training protocols didn't fully exploit available capabilities. Students received competent but limited instruction that prepared them for conventional security assignments, but not the increasingly complex threat environments that modern private security personnel encountered. Sarah had been playing defense for 3 years, adapting her recommendations to fit within acceptable parameters and limiting her input to areas that wouldn't challenge institutional assumptions. But the systematic restriction of her access and the deliberate dismissal of her expertise represented something beyond normal bureaucratic friction. It was time to stop accommodating a system that wasted her capabilities and start exploring alternatives that would allow her to contribute effectively to training programs that actually prepared students for operational realities. The tattoos beneath her sleeves represented qualifications that far exceeded anything available at Blackstone Academy. Soon, she would find an environment where those qualifications could be properly utilized, even if it meant leaving behind 3 years of careful relationship building and professional development. Outside the storage facility windows, she could see the academy's main training area where tomorrow's exercises would be conducted, according to protocols that hadn't been updated in 5 years. Students would receive instruction that was adequate for basic security assignments, but insufficient for the challenging environments where many of them would eventually work. Change was coming to Blackstone Academy, whether Hawthorne recognized it or not. The question was whether that change would come from within, through the recognition and proper utilization of existing expertise, or from external pressure when their graduates proved inadequately prepared for operational realities. Sarah gathered her equipment inventories and secured the facility for the night. By Saturday evening, she would know whether her future lay in continuing to fight against institutional resistance or in finding an organization that recognized and valued the capabilities she'd spent years developing in the world's most demanding operational environments. The opportunity arrived in the form of a priority contract that would define Blackstone Academy's reputation for years to come. Meridian Corporation, one of the largest private military contractors in the world, needed an intensive training program for their executive protection teams, deploying to high-risk environments in Eastern Europe. The contract was worth $3 million over 18 months and represented the kind of prestige assignment that could elevate Blackstone from regional training facility to nationally recognized Academy. Sarah first learned about the Meridian contract during a mandatory all-staff meeting on Thursday morning. Director Hawthorne stood at the front of the main conference room, his presentation displaying impressive financial projections and expansion opportunities that would result from successful completion of the program. This represents the most significant contract in Blackstone's history, Hawthorne announced to the assembled instructors. Meridian is specifically requesting advanced tactical training that goes beyond our standard curriculum. They need operators capable of functioning in contested environments, where traditional law enforcement protocols are insufficient. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. This was exactly the type of training she'd been advocating for during her 3 years at the academy. Her classified background included extensive experience in precisely the operational environments that Meridian's teams would encounter: executive protection in hostile territories, low visibility operations in politically sensitive areas, coordination with foreign military and intelligence services. These were core competencies she developed during her JSOC assignments. The training program will require specialized instruction in several areas, Hawthorne continued, advancing his presentation. Advanced weapons handling, stress inoculation under realistic conditions, multi-threat environment navigation, and integration with host nation security forces. We'll be developing an entirely new curriculum specifically for this contract. Assistant Director Walsh raised her hand. Who's being considered for lead instructor on this program? I'll be personally overseeing the program development, Hawthorne replied. Senior Instructor Reynolds will handle tactical operations training, and we're bringing in contracted specialists for advanced weapons instruction and scenario development. Sarah raised her hand, her heart racing but her voice steady. Sir, I'd like to volunteer for the curriculum development team. My logistics background includes coordination with similar programs, and I have experience with the equipment specifications that Meridian will require. The room fell silent. Several instructors turned to look at her, expressions ranging from surprise to skepticism. Hawthorne's jaw tightened visibly. Mitchell, this program requires tactical expertise beyond equipment. Coordination, he said dismissively. We need instructors with operational experience in high-threat environments, not logistics support personnel. Actually, sir, Sarah continued, maintaining her professional composure despite the familiar sting of dismissal, I've reviewed the preliminary requirements that Meridian submitted. They're specifically requesting training integration that combines tactical operations with logistical support in austere environments. The operational success of their teams will depend as much on supply chain security and equipment reliability as on tactical proficiency. Reynolds leaned forward in his chair. What exactly do you know about executive protection in contested environments, Mitchell? Sarah felt the weight of 3 years of careful concealment pressing against her desire to contribute meaningfully to this critical program. I understand that traditional executive protection focuses on threat avoidance and controlled environments. But overseas operations require capability to function when those controls break down. Teams need to be prepared for equipment failures, communication disruption, and supply chain compromise while maintaining protection of their principles. Walsh smirked. That sounds like something you read in a manual, not something you've actually experienced. The comment hit Sarah like a physical blow, not because it was accurate, but because it represented the fundamental assumption that had limited her contributions for 3 years. Everyone in the room saw her as someone whose knowledge came from books and classroom instruction, not from operational experience that she couldn't discuss. Furthermore, Hawthorne interjected, Meridian has specifically requested instructors with verifiable combat experience and advanced tactical certifications. They're not interested in theoretical knowledge or equipment management expertise. Sarah felt her opportunity slipping away, not because she lacked the qualifications, but because she couldn't reveal the qualifications she possessed. "Sir, I believe I could contribute significantly to this program. If you would review my complete background file. Your background file shows Army logistics experience with one deployment to a quiet sector in Afghanistan." Walsh interrupted. "Meridian is preparing teams for potential combat operations in active conflict zones. They need instructors who've actually been shot at, not someone who managed supply convoys in secure areas." The assumption was so far from reality that Sarah almost laughed, but the laughter would have been bitter. She had indeed been shot at, by snipers in urban environments, by insurgents during direct action missions, by hostile forces during extraction operations that had gone sideways. She'd returned fire effectively, coordinated tactical responses under extreme stress, and managed complex operations where equipment failure or logistical breakdown meant mission failure and potential casualties, but none of that experience existed in her official record. "I understand your perspective, ma'am," Sarah said carefully, "but I think my experience might be more relevant than my file indicates. If I could have the opportunity to demonstrate." Mitchell Hawthorne's voice carried the tone of final authority. "This discussion is closed. The Meridian program requires expertise that you simply don't possess. Your role in this contract will be limited to equipment procurement and facility coordination. That's where your qualifications are best utilized." Sarah felt the familiar heat of frustration rising in her face, but she maintained her professional expression. Around the room, she could see the mixture of sympathy and relief in her colleagues' faces. Sympathy because they recognized her disappointment. Relief because they understood that challenging Hawthorne's decisions publicly was career-limiting behavior. "I'd like to formally request consideration for advanced instructor positions on this program," Sarah said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I believe I can contribute more than equipment coordination." Hawthorne exchanged glances with Walsh, and Sarah saw something pass between them, a confirmation of assumptions that had been building for months. "Request noted and denied," Hawthorne said flatly. "Your current assignment is appropriate for your qualifications and experience level." The meeting continued for another 30 minutes, covering administrative details and timeline requirements for the Meridian program. Sarah remained in her seat, listening to discussions about training methodology she'd actually implemented, equipment specifications she'd tested under combat conditions, and operational scenarios she'd survived in environments more challenging than anything Meridian's teams would likely encounter. When the meeting ended, she remained seated as other instructors filed out, most avoiding eye contact, but a few offering supportive nods. Rivera paused beside her chair. "Sarah, I'm sorry about that. Maybe there will be other opportunities." "Maybe," she replied, though they both knew that this kind of contract didn't come along often, and her public rejection would likely influence future assignment decisions. After the room emptied, Sarah sat alone, staring at her hands folded on the conference table. Beneath her long sleeves, the tattoos that represented her actual qualifications remained hidden. The JSOC lightning bolt that marked her as qualified for exactly the type of training Meridian was requesting. The coordinates tattooed around her Ranger tab that marked locations where she'd conducted operations. Far more challenging than anything in Blackstone's curriculum. Most frustrating of all, the small trident that represented completion of training. Programs that didn't officially exist. Programs that had prepared her for precisely the operational environments that Hawthorne claimed were beyond her capabilities. That afternoon, Sarah received an unofficial visit from Master Instructor Rivera and Technical Instructor Amanda Vasquez, one of the few other women on Blackstone's training staff. They found her in the equipment storage facility, conducting inventory checks with mechanical precision. "Sarah," Vasquez said quietly, We wanted you to know that what happened in the meeting was bullshit. Rivera nodded agreement. Half the instructors in that room don't have the operational experience that Meridian is really looking for. Hell, most of us have never worked overseas protection details or dealt with the logistics challenges that come with extended operations in hostile territory. But I can't prove that I have that experience, Sarah replied, not looking up from her inventory sheets. And apparently, suggesting that I might be more qualified than my file indicates is considered insubordination. What exactly is in your file? Vasquez asked, because something doesn't add up. You know too much about operational procedures to have spent your deployment pushing paperwork in Kabul. Sarah considered her response carefully. These were colleagues she trusted, people who had supported her consistently during her time at Blackstone. But revealing any details about her actual military service would raise questions she couldn't answer and potentially compromise operational security for missions that remained classified. Let's just say that Army logistics includes more than most people realize, she said finally. And deployed logistics specialists sometimes end up in situations that aren't reflected in official records. Rivera studied her for a moment. Sarah, if you really have the qualifications for the Meridian program, isn't there some way to document them? Military records, training certificates, something that would change Hawthorne's assessment. The kind of experience they're looking for doesn't always generate documentation that survives in accessible files, Sarah replied carefully. And some qualifications can't be discussed outside of very specific channels. Vasquez and Rivera exchanged glances, both beginning to understand that Sarah's background might be more complex than anyone at Blackstone realized. What are you going to do? Vasquez asked. Sarah finally looked up from her inventory sheets, meeting their eyes with an expression that was calm but determined. I'm going to find a way to demonstrate my qualifications, even if I can't discuss how I acquired them. That evening, Sarah composed a detailed analysis of the Meridian training requirements, drawing on her actual operational experience to identify specific challenges and solutions that wouldn't appear in conventional training manuals. Her analysis addressed equipment selection for extended operations, logistics planning for teams operating without reliable resupply, communication protocols for politically sensitive environments, and stress management techniques for high-pressure situations. The document was 15 pages of tactical insights that demonstrated understanding of operational realities that went far beyond academic knowledge. She submitted it through official channels as a suggested enhancement to proposed curriculum development, knowing that Hawthorne would likely dismiss it without serious review, but creating a permanent record of her capabilities. More importantly, she forwarded a copy to Colonel Hayes with a brief message: assessment of current institutional limitations and demonstration of underutilized capabilities. Recommend immediate consultation regarding alternative opportunities. The Meridian contract represented everything Sarah had been working toward during her 3 years at Blackstone, an opportunity to apply her actual qualifications to meaningful training that would prepare operators for real-world challenges. Her exclusion from the program wasn't based on legitimate assessment of her capabilities, but on assumptions derived from carefully sanitized records that concealed her true background. Soon, she would have to choose between continuing to accept limitations based on those assumptions or revealing enough about her actual qualifications to demonstrate that she was exactly what the Meridian program needed. The choice would determine not only her future at Blackstone, but potentially the effectiveness of training that would directly impact operator safety in some of the world's most dangerous environments. The tattoos beneath her sleeves told a story of qualifications that far exceeded anything available among Blackstone's current instructor staff. The question was whether she was ready to reveal that story, with all the complications and consequences that such revelation would bring. The retaliation began subtly, as institutional punishment often does. Sarah first noticed it when her scheduled equipment maintenance rotations were mysteriously reassigned to junior staff members without explanation. Then her access to the Academy's training records database was restricted to read-only status, preventing her from updating equipment logs or coordinating maintenance schedules that had been her responsibility for 3 years. By Wednesday of the following week, the pressure had escalated significantly. Sarah arrived at her workstation to find a formal written reprimand in her inbox, citing inappropriate challenge to established authority during official meetings and attempts to exceed assigned duties without proper authorization. The document, signed by Director Hawthorne and witnessed by Assistant Director Walsh, would become part of her permanent personnel file. The reprimand stung, not because it threatened her position, but because it represented a deliberate mischaracterization of her professional conduct. Every interaction she'd had with Academy leadership had been conducted through proper channels, with appropriate respect for hierarchy, and with genuine intent to improve training effectiveness. Yet the official record now portrayed her as insubordinate and overreaching. Master Instructor Rivera found her reviewing the reprimand during lunch break, sitting alone in the small break room adjacent to the equipment storage facility. "Sarah, I heard about the disciplinary action. This is getting out of hand." "It's a calculated escalation," Sarah replied quietly. "They're creating documentation to justify more severe action if I continue to challenge their decisions." Rivera sat across from her, lowering his voice. "Look, I've been asking around about the Meridian contract. The requirements they've submitted are way beyond what most of our instructors can deliver. Hell, Reynolds has never worked executive protection outside the continental United States, and Walsh's federal experience was all domestic counterterrorism. They're going to struggle with this program." Sarah nodded. She'd reached the same conclusion after reviewing the detailed contract specifications that had been distributed to senior staff. Meridian was requesting training for operations in environments where traditional law enforcement tactics would be insufficient and where military-style capabilities would be essential for mission success. "There's something else," Rivera continued. "Technical Instructor Vasquez has been asking questions about your background. Not official inquiries, just professional curiosity. She thinks there's more to your military service than what's in your file." "What kind of questions?" "Equipment. Knowledge, mostly. She noticed that you're familiar with weapon systems and tactical gear that Army logistics specialists wouldn't normally encounter. You knew detailed specifications for equipment she'd only seen used by special operations units during joint training exercises." Sarah felt a familiar tension in her stomach. For 3 years, she'd carefully modulated her knowledge base to match her official background, but the Meridian contract discussions had pushed her to reveal more expertise than her cover story could easily explain. "Amanda's former Marine intelligence," Rivera continued. "She worked joint operations with some pretty specialized units during her deployment. She recognizes advanced tactical knowledge when she sees it." The implications were significant. If Vasquez was beginning to suspect that Sarah's military background was more complex than her official record indicated, other observant colleagues might be reaching similar conclusions. The careful balance between demonstrating competence and maintaining operational security was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. That afternoon, Sarah received an unexpected summons to Director Hawthorne's office. She arrived at the scheduled time to find not only Hawthorne, but also Walsh and Deputy Director Foster waiting for her. The meeting setup immediately indicated that this was more than routine administrative business. Instructor Mitchell, Hawthorne began without preamble. "We need to address some concerns that have come to our attention regarding your recent performance and professional conduct." Sarah remained standing, as no one had invited her to sit. "I'm ready to address any concerns you may have, sir." Walsh consulted a folder that contained what appeared to be detailed documentation. "We've received reports that you've been discussing Academy training protocols with outside personnel, specifically regarding the Meridian contract requirements. The accusation was both specific and false, designed to test Sarah's response and potentially provide justification for more severe disciplinary action. Ma'am, I haven't discussed any confidential Academy information with unauthorized personnel. All my communications regarding Academy business have been conducted through appropriate channels. Are you certain about that? Hawthorne asked. Because we have information suggesting that you've been in contact with individuals outside our organization regarding training methodologies and equipment specifications. Sarah realized they were fishing, trying to provoke an admission or reaction. That would provide grounds for escalating their campaign against her. Her secure communications with Colonel Hayes were conducted through encrypted channels that Academy personnel couldn't access, but they might have noticed unusual communication patterns or security protocols that raised suspicions. Sir, I maintain professional contacts throughout the security training industry, as do most instructors. All such communications are conducted in accordance with Academy policies regarding confidentiality and professional conduct. Foster, who had been silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke. Sarah, the concern isn't about professional networking. The concern is about discussing specific contract details and training requirements with people who don't have authorization to receive that information. I need to see specific allegations with supporting evidence, Sarah replied firmly. If there are claims that I've violated confidentiality protocols, I'm entitled to review the documentation supporting those claims. Walsh and Hawthorne exchanged glances, and Sarah recognized that they didn't have substantive evidence to support their accusations. This was an intimidation tactic designed to pressure her into resignation or compliance with their restrictions on her activities. The point, Hawthorne said with barely controlled irritation, is that your recent behavior suggests someone who's dissatisfied with their current assignment and looking for alternatives outside our organization. That kind of attitude creates security risks and undermines unit cohesion. The irony of the accusation was almost overwhelming. Sarah had spent 3 years demonstrating exceptional loyalty to Blackstone Academy, consistently exceeding performance expectations and contributing significantly to program effectiveness despite systematic underutilization of her capabilities. Her dissatisfaction stemmed not from personal ambition, but from recognition that the Academy was failing to maximize available resources for student benefit. My commitment to this Academy and its mission is absolute, Sarah said carefully. If my efforts to improve our training programs have been misinterpreted as dissatisfaction, I apologize for any confusion. Your efforts to exceed your assigned duties, Walsh corrected sharply, have created disruption and undermined established training protocols. That's not program improvement, that's insubordination. The meeting continued for another 20 minutes, with increasingly hostile questioning designed to provoke a defensive response that could be characterized as further insubordination. Sarah maintained professional composure throughout, providing direct answers while avoiding any statements that could be twisted to support additional disciplinary action. When the meeting finally ended, she understood clearly that her position at Blackstone was becoming untenable. The systematic pressure being applied wasn't random harassment, but a calculated campaign to force her resignation or create justification for termination. That evening, technical instructor Vasquez approached her in the Academy parking lot as Sarah was leaving for the day. Can we talk privately? There's something I need to tell you. They drove to a small coffee shop several miles from the Academy, where Vasquez began with an apology. Sarah, I need to come clean about something. I've been asking questions about your background because things haven't been adding up. Sarah felt her pulse quicken but maintained a neutral expression. What kind of things? Equipment knowledge. That goes way beyond standard Army logistics training. Tactical awareness that suggests operational experience in contested environments. understanding of special operations procedures that most conventional military personnel never encounter. Vasquez paused, studying Sarah carefully. I think your military service was significantly different from what's in your official file. The moment Sarah had been dreading for 3 years had finally arrived. Someone with sufficient expertise had recognized inconsistencies in her cover story that could no longer be explained by exceptional competence or professional development. Amanda, I can't discuss details about my military service beyond what's in my official record. Can't or won't. Can't. Some aspects of military service generate records that aren't accessible through normal channels, and some experiences can't be discussed outside of very specific security protocols. Vasquez nodded slowly. That explains a lot. Sarah, I need you to know that Hawthorne asked me to document any observations I had about inconsistencies in your background. He's building a file that he thinks will support accusations about falsified credentials or exaggerated qualifications. The revelation was both surprising and inevitable. Sarah had suspected that the pressure against her was more systematic than routine personnel management, but she hadn't realized the extent of the investigation being conducted. What did you tell him? Nothing. Because what I observed suggests that you're significantly more qualified than your file indicates, not less. Your knowledge base comes from operational experience, not academic study. That's not credential fraud. That's classified background. Sarah sat quietly for a moment, processing the implications of Vasquez's assessment. Her cover was beginning to fail under scrutiny from personnel with sufficient expertise to recognize advanced military training. But that failure was actually confirming her qualifications rather than undermining them. Amanda, I appreciate your discretion, but this situation is becoming complicated in ways that could affect your career as well as mine. My career will be fine, Vasquez replied firmly. But yours is in serious jeopardy if Hawthorne succeeds in characterizing you as someone with falsified qualifications. The irony is that he's completely wrong about the direction of the discrepancy. After returning to the academy, Sarah found a secure location and composed a detailed message to Colonel Hayes, describing the escalating pressure and the risk that continued investigation might compromise operational security for missions that remained classified. The response arrived within hours. Situation acknowledged. Extraction protocols activated. Report to designated location Friday 0800 for immediate consultation and transition planning. For 3 years, Sarah had maintained her cover while contributing as effectively as possible within the constraints of her assigned role. But the systematic campaign to undermine her position had reached a point where continued concealment was becoming impossible, and revelation would create risks that extended far beyond her personal career. The time had come to transition from defensive concealment to active demonstration of her actual capabilities. The tattoos beneath her sleeves represented qualifications that would revolutionize Blackstone's training programs if properly utilized. But institutional resistance had made such utilization impossible within the Academy's current leadership structure. Soon, Director Hawthorne would discover that his campaign to eliminate what he perceived as an unqualified instructor had actually driven away someone whose capabilities far exceeded anything available among his current staff. The Meridian contract that he considered so challenging would prove to be well within the expertise range of the instructor he'd systematically excluded from meaningful participation. Sarah gathered her personal items from her workstation, knowing that Friday's consultation would likely determine whether her future lay in continued concealment within an organization that couldn't recognize her value, or in transition to an environment where her actual qualifications could be properly employed. The choice was no longer between revealing her background or maintaining her position. The choice had become between accepting systematic suppression of capabilities that could benefit students and operators in life-threatening situations, or finding an environment where those capabilities could be utilized without compromise. Either way, the careful balance she'd maintained for 3 years was about to shift dramatically, with consequences that would extend far beyond her personal career trajectory. The confrontation that would change everything was scheduled for 0800 in Conference Room C, the sterile windowless space where careers were dissected and professional futures determined behind closed doors. Sarah arrived 15 minutes early, her personnel documentation organized in a leather portfolio, her uniform pressed to regulation perfection. Despite knowing that appearance would matter little in what was essentially a predetermined tribunal, she'd barely slept, but her mind was clear and focused as she arranged her materials on the conference table. The folder containing her sanitized military record sat beside a second folder that she'd never opened at Blackstone, one containing documentation that could revolutionize their understanding of her qualifications but would also raise questions about operational security that she couldn't answer. Director Hawthorne entered at precisely 0800, followed by Assistant Director Walsh, Deputy Director Foster, and, in an unexpected development, Academy Board member Victoria Chambers, whose presence indicated that this meeting had implications beyond routine personnel action. Sarah's pulse quickened. Board involvement meant that decisions made here would be final and institutional. Instructor Mitchell, Hawthorne began without preamble, remaining standing to emphasize his authority. It has come to our attention that significant discrepancies exist between your stated qualifications and your demonstrated capabilities during your tenure at this academy. Sarah felt ice forming in her veins. Sir, I need to see the specific allegations you're referencing. Assistant Director Walsh opened a folder with theatrical precision. On Monday, October 15th, you demonstrated detailed knowledge of specialized weapons systems during equipment inventory that exceeds standard Army logistics training. On Wednesday, October 17th, you provided tactical assessments during the morning briefing that suggested operational experience inconsistent with your official military record. On Friday, October 19th, you were observed using advanced communication protocols that are typically restricted to personnel with specialized security clearances. Each accusation was technically accurate, but completely misinterpreted. Sarah's knowledge came from years of operational experience with the most elite units in the military, but explaining that would require revealing information that remained classified at the highest levels. Furthermore, Walsh continued, we have reason to believe that you have been misrepresenting your military background to gain employment and advancement opportunities for which you are not qualified. The accusation hit Sarah like a physical blow, not because it was accurate, but because it was so fundamentally wrong in the opposite direction. They suspected her of inflating her qualifications when the truth was that she'd been systematically understating them for 3 years. Ma'am, every statement I've made about my military service has been accurate according to my official records. Your official records, Hawthorne interjected, show a single deployment to a quiet logistics base in Afghanistan with no combat exposure or specialized training. Yet you consistently demonstrate knowledge and capabilities that suggest significantly different experience. Board member Chambers leaned forward, her expression stern but curious. Instructor Mitchell, are you claiming that your official military record is complete and accurate? The question was carefully phrased, creating a trap that Sarah recognized immediately. If she confirmed that her record was complete, she was lying. If she suggested it was incomplete, she was admitting to concealment that could be characterized as fraud. Ma'am, my official military record accurately reflects the information that's available through standard personnel channels. That's not what I asked, Chambers replied sharply. I asked whether your record is complete and accurate. Sarah met her gaze steadily, understanding that this moment would determine not only her future at Blackstone, but potentially her ability to work in the civilian security industry at all. Ma'am, some aspects of military service generate documentation that isn't accessible through conventional record systems. The admission created immediate tension in the room. Foster shifted uncomfortably. Walsh's expression hardened, and Hawthorne's jaw tightened visibly. "Are you suggesting," Walsh said slowly, "that you have classified military experience that isn't reflected in your personnel file?" "I'm stating that military personnel records don't always contain complete information about an individual's service, particularly for personnel who've worked in specialized assignments." Hawthorne's voice carried barely controlled anger. "Mitchell, if you're claiming special operations experience, we need documentation. We need proof. We can't have instructors whose qualifications can't be verified through official channels." The irony was overwhelming. For 3 years, Sarah had been criticized for supposedly lacking qualifications that she actually possessed in abundance. Now she was being accused of fraud for the same qualifications that could have revolutionized their training programs if properly utilized. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Sir, I understand your concern about verification, but some military assignments don't generate documentation that's accessible to civilian employers. "That's convenient," Walsh replied sarcastically. "So we're supposed to take your word that you have advanced qualifications that can't be verified?" Board member Chambers consulted her tablet, apparently reviewing information that hadn't been shared with the others. "Instructor Mitchell, I've been examining your employment application and your performance evaluations during your tenure here. Your application stated that you had specialized experience in tactical operations coordination, but your military record shows only conventional logistics assignments." Sarah realized that Chambers had done more extensive background research than the Academy's standard hiring process typically included. Her application language had been carefully chosen to be accurate while avoiding details that would raise security concerns. "Ma'am, tactical operations coordination encompasses a broad range of activities that aren't always reflected in simplified military occupational specialties, such as..." The question forced Sarah to make a choice that she'd been avoiding for 3 years. She could continue to evade and deflect, maintaining operational security while accepting career destruction, or she could reveal enough information to defend herself while potentially compromising classified programs, such as coordination of personnel and equipment for operations conducted by specialized units in contested environments, she said carefully. Operations that require security. Protocols beyond standard military training. Hawthorne leaned forward aggressively. "What specialized units? What operations? If you're going to make these claims, you need to provide specifics." Sarah sat quietly for a moment, recognizing that she'd reached the point where continued concealment was impossible, but complete revelation was forbidden. The solution required a calculated risk that could either validate her position or destroy it entirely. She reached into her portfolio and extracted her smartphone, opening the secure communication application that she'd used to maintain contact with her former command structure. Her fingers moved quickly across the screen, composing a message that would either save her career or end it. "I'm requesting verification of my qualifications through appropriate channels," she announced to the room. "You'll have confirmation within the hour." Walsh looked skeptical. "From whom?" "From personnel who have appropriate security clearances to discuss my actual military background." The message Sarah had sent was brief but comprehensive. Immediate verification required. Civilian employment threatened by security restrictions. Request authorized disclosure of qualification summary for employment purposes. Chambers studied Sarah carefully. "You're claiming that your military experience is classified. I'm stating that some aspects of my military service require verification through specialized channels that weren't available during the standard hiring process. And you expect us to wait for this mysterious verification?" "Ma'am, if you're questioning the validity of my qualifications, Verification through proper channels seems appropriate before making final personnel decisions. The room fell silent except for the hum of the air conditioning system. Sarah could see calculation in each face around the table, Hawthorne's anger warring with uncertainty, Welsh's skepticism mixed with growing concern, Foster's discomfort with the entire situation, and Chambers' professional curiosity about what she might have missed during the hiring process. Sarah's phone chimed with an incoming message. She glanced at the screen and felt relief flood through her system. "Sir, I have preliminary response from my verification request." "From whom?" Hawthorne demanded. Sarah read from her screen. "Colonel Patricia Hayes, Joint Special Operations Command Personnel Office. She's requesting contact information for Academy leadership to provide appropriate verification of my background." The effect was immediate and dramatic. Foster's eyebrows rose significantly. Walsh's aggressive posture shifted to uncomfortable. Attention, and even Hawthorne's anger was replaced by uncertainty. Board member Chambers spoke first. "Joint Special Operations Command?" "Yes, ma'am. Colonel Hayes was my commanding officer during my final military assignment. She's authorized to discuss my qualifications within appropriate security parameters." Chambers consulted her tablet again, apparently searching for information about JSOC verification procedures. "How long will this verification process take?" Sarah's phone chimed again. "Ma'am, Colonel Hayes is requesting a conference call at your earliest convenience. She has information that will clarify any questions about my military background and qualifications." Hawthorne looked trapped. He'd expected this meeting to result in Sarah's termination based on suspected credential fraud, but the involvement of Joint Special Operations Command suggested that his assumptions about her background were fundamentally incorrect. "We'll need time to prepare for that conversation," Foster said diplomatically. "Actually," Sarah replied, reading another message, "Colonel Hayes is available now if you'd prefer immediate clarification." The suggestion created visible tension around the table. None of them had expected this confrontation to involve communication with elite military units, and the implications were becoming increasingly clear that Sarah's qualifications might be significantly different from what they'd assumed. "Before we make that call," Chambers said slowly, "I need to understand what we're likely to learn. Are you claiming special operations experience?" Sarah met her gaze directly. "Ma'am, I'm stating that my military service included assignments that required security clearances and operational capabilities that aren't reflected in standard personnel records. The extent of those assignments can be discussed with appropriate verification." Walsh looked pale. "If that's true, why didn't you mention it during your employment process?" "Because operational security requirements prohibited disclosure without authorization from appropriate command authority." The admission hung in the air like a physical presence. Everyone in the room was beginning to understand that their assumptions about Sarah's background had been not just wrong, but dramatically wrong in ways that had significant implications for their treatment of her during her tenure at Blackstone. Hawthorne's voice was strained when he finally spoke. "If you have Joint Special Operations Command qualifications, why have you been working as an equipment coordinator?" "Because that was the position offered to me when I applied, and I've performed those duties to the best of my ability while waiting for opportunities to contribute more significantly to the Academy's mission." Sarah's phone displayed another message from Colonel Hayes, standing by for immediate consultation. "Recommend expedited resolution of employment issues." Chambers looked around the table at her colleagues, all of whom appeared to be reassessing everything they thought they knew about the instructor they'd been preparing to terminate for credential fraud. "I think," Chambers said carefully, "we need to make that phone call." The conference call with Colonel Hayes lasted exactly 18 minutes and fundamentally altered the trajectory of Sarah's career at Blackstone Academy. By the time the connection ended, Director Hawthorne sat in stunned silence. Assistant Director Walsh had gone pale. And board member Chambers was furiously taking notes on information that completely contradicted every assumption they'd made. About their equipment coordinator, Colonel Hayes had been diplomatically ruthless in her verification of Sarah's background. Without revealing classified operational details, she'd confirmed that Sarah possessed advanced tactical certifications that exceeded the qualifications of most conventional military personnel, had participated in specialized training programs that were restricted to elite units, and had demonstrated exceptional performance in operational environments that remained classified. To summarize, Chambers said after ending the call, Instructor Mitchell has Joint Special Operations Command training that qualifies her for advanced tactical instruction, specialized weapons expertise that exceeds anything currently available at this academy, and operational experience in precisely the environments that our Meridian contract is designed to address. The transformation in the room's atmosphere was palpable. Hawthorne's authority had evaporated with the revelation that his systematic suppression of Sarah's contributions had been based on fundamental misunderstanding of her capabilities. Walsh's aggressive skepticism had been replaced by uncomfortable recognition that her accusations of credential fraud had been not just wrong but professionally embarrassing. Foster cleared his throat nervously. "Sarah, I owe you an apology. We clearly didn't understand the extent of your qualifications. The question now," Chambers continued, "is how we address the gap between your actual capabilities and your current assignment. It appears that we've been significantly underutilizing your expertise." Sarah remained composed despite the vindication flooding through her system. "Ma'am, I've been content to contribute within my assigned role, but I believe I could provide more value in areas that better match my background." Hawthorne finally spoke, his voice strained. "The Meridian contract. You were right about having relevant experience." "Yes, sir. My background includes extensive experience with executive protection in contested environments, logistics coordination for specialized units, and training development for operations in politically sensitive areas." Walsh looked stricken. "We need you on that program." The training requirements that Meridian submitted are exactly what Colonel Hayes described as your areas of expertise. The irony was overwhelming. 3 days earlier, Sarah had been excluded from the Meridian program because her qualifications were supposedly insufficient. Now, with her actual background partially revealed, it was clear that she was the most qualified instructor at the academy for exactly that type of training. "Unfortunately," Chambers said, consulting her tablet, "we've already committed to a specific instructor lineup for the Meridian program. Changing that now would require explanation to the client about why our initial assessment was incorrect." Sarah recognized the institutional problem immediately. Acknowledging her qualifications for the Meridian program would require admitting that academy leadership had failed to properly evaluate their own personnel, potentially damaging their credibility with a critical client. "There might be another solution," Sarah said carefully. "Meridian's requirements include training integration that combines tactical operations with logistics coordination. Rather than changing the primary instructor assignments, I could serve as a specialized consultant for specific training modules." Foster leaned forward. "What kind of modules?" "Advanced equipment management under hostile conditions, supply chain, security for extended operations, integration with host nation forces, and stress management for high-pressure environments. These are areas where my background could enhance the program without disrupting existing instructor assignments." Hawthorne looked relieved at the prospect of saving face while utilizing Sarah's capabilities. "That could work. We could position it as bringing in specialized expertise to enhance the program." "Actually," Chambers interrupted, "I think we need to consider a more comprehensive solution. If Instructor Mitchell has qualifications that we've been unaware of, we should evaluate whether other aspects of our training programs could benefit from her expertise." The suggestion created visible tension. Systematic elevation of Sarah's role would require acknowledging that Academy leadership had made fundamental errors in personnel assessment and program development. Sarah's phone chimed with an incoming message from Colonel Hayes. Additional opportunity available. Recommend private consultation before making final decisions about current position. Sarah glanced at the message, understanding that her former commanding officer was offering alternatives that might be more attractive than remaining at Blackstone, even with improved assignment prospects. I appreciate the consideration, Sarah said diplomatically, but I think we should focus on immediate solutions for the Meridian program. My primary concern is ensuring that our students receive the most effective training possible. Over the next hour, they developed a framework for Sarah's integration into the Meridian program that would enhance training effectiveness while minimizing institutional embarrassment. She would serve as a specialized instructor for specific modules. Her advanced qualifications would be presented as recently verified rather than previously overlooked, and her role would be expanded gradually based on program requirements. But even as they discussed implementation details, Sarah recognized that her relationship with Blackstone leadership had been fundamentally altered. The trust that had been damaged by months of systematic suppression and accusations couldn't be easily restored, and her elevated status would create ongoing tensions with colleagues who had participated in marginalizing her contributions. That afternoon, Sarah received an unexpected visitor. Technical instructor Vasquez found her in the equipment storage facility, where she was conducting inventory checks that had taken on new significance now that her qualifications for advanced program development had been confirmed. Sarah, I heard about the meeting. Word is traveling fast that you have special operations background. Some aspects of my military service have been clarified, Sarah replied carefully. The rumor is that you're qualified to teach advanced tactical operations that go beyond anything we currently offer. Sarah studied Vasquez carefully. Among her colleagues, Amanda represented someone who might understand the complexities of transitioning from classified military assignments to civilian employment. Amanda, can I ask you something confidentially? Of course. If you discovered that an organization had been systematically underutilizing your capabilities for years, would you stay to try to improve the situation, or would you look for opportunities where your qualifications could be better employed? Vasquez considered the question seriously. Depends on whether the organization's leadership was willing to acknowledge their mistakes and make genuine changes, or whether they were just trying to minimize embarrassment while maintaining their existing approaches. And how would you tell the difference? By watching what happens over the next few weeks. Real change requires admitting fundamental errors and implementing systematic improvements. Cosmetic change just adjusts surface appearances while maintaining underlying problems. The conversation was interrupted by Master Instructor Rivera, who approached with obvious excitement. Sarah, I just heard about your background verification. This explains so much about your equipment knowledge and tactical insights. Carlos, I appreciate your support, but we need to be careful about how we discuss this situation. Why? You've been holding back expertise that could have improved our programs for years. Now that your qualifications are confirmed, we should be celebrating and figuring out how to maximize your contributions. Rivera's enthusiasm was genuine but naive. He didn't understand the institutional dynamics that made Sarah's situation more complex than simple qualification verification. The challenge, Sarah explained, is that expanding my role requires acknowledging that Academy leadership made systematic errors in personnel assessment. That's professionally difficult for people in positions of authority. So what's going to happen? That depends on whether leadership prioritizes program improvement or reputation management. That evening, Sarah met Colonel Hayes at a discreet location 40 minutes from the Academy. Her former commanding officer had aged noticeably since their last meeting, but her assessment of tactical situations remained as sharp as ever. Sarah, I reviewed your situation after our conference call today. The Academy's leadership seems genuinely surprised by your qualifications, but I'm concerned about whether they'll be able to utilize your capabilities effectively. What do you mean? Institutional resistance to change is powerful, especially when that change requires admitting significant errors. They may intend to use your expertise for the Meridian program, but they'll likely struggle with broader integration of your capabilities. Hayes paused, studying Sarah carefully. I have an alternative proposal that might be more attractive than remaining at Blackstone, even with improved assignments. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. What kind of alternative? A new training facility being established by a consortium of private military contractors. They're specifically looking for instructors with advanced qualifications who can develop training programs for complex operational environments. Your background makes you an ideal candidate for senior instructor positions. The opportunity was tempting, but Sarah had invested 3 years in building relationships and developing programs at Blackstone. What would be the timeline for that kind of transition? Immediate, if you're interested. They're particularly interested in personnel who can address the training gaps that conventional programs aren't filling. Sarah considered the offer carefully. The new facility would provide opportunities to utilize her full range of capabilities without the institutional resistance that she'd encountered at Blackstone. But leaving now would abandon the potential improvements she could implement for students who needed more effective training. Can I have some time to evaluate how the situation develops here? Of course, but don't wait too long. Opportunities like this don't remain available indefinitely. After returning to her apartment, Sarah spent the evening reviewing documentation from the Meridian contract and developing preliminary training modules that would demonstrate her capabilities while contributing meaningfully to student preparation. Materials she developed drew heavily on her operational experience, providing practical insights into challenges that students would encounter in real-world environments. Equipment selection for extended operations in austere conditions, communication protocols for politically sensitive areas, stress management techniques for high-pressure situations, and integration procedures for working with foreign military and security forces. Each module represented knowledge that could significantly enhance student preparation, but implementing them would require institutional commitment to systematic program improvements rather than superficial adjustments to accommodate her newly revealed qualifications. By morning, Sarah had developed a comprehensive proposal for enhancing the Meridian program that would serve as a test of Blackstone leadership's genuine commitment to utilizing her capabilities. If they embraced her recommendations and implemented systematic improvements, she would remain and continue contributing to program development. If they limited her involvement to minimal roles that protected their previous decisions, she would pursue the alternative opportunities that Colonel Hayes had outlined. The next few days would determine whether her revelation of classified qualifications would lead to meaningful change at Blackstone Academy, or simply create a more sophisticated form of the institutional resistance that had characterized her experience for the past 3 years. Either way, the careful concealment that had defined her civilian career was ending. Her capabilities were now part of the official record, and her future would be determined by how effectively those capabilities could be employed rather than how successfully they could be hidden. The tattoos beneath her sleeves no longer represented a dangerous secret that could compromise her position. They now represented validated qualifications that demanded appropriate utilization, regardless of whether that utilization occurred at Blackstone Academy or somewhere else entirely. The crisis that would define Sarah's future at Blackstone Academy arrived without warning on a Tuesday morning when Meridian Corporation's advance team arrived for their preliminary assessment of the Academy's capabilities. What was supposed to be a routine evaluation became a comprehensive test when their delegation included former special operations personnel who immediately recognized gaps in Blackstone's proposed training curriculum. Sarah was conducting equipment inventory in the main storage facility when Master Instructor Rivera found her at 0730 hours, his expression indicating urgent concern. "Sarah, we have a situation developing with the Meridian evaluation. They're asking specific questions about training methodologies that are proposed. Instructors can't answer adequately." "What kind of questions?" "Advanced tactical movement in urban environments, integration with host nation forces, logistics coordination for extended operations without reliable resupply." "The kind of operational knowledge that goes beyond conventional training." Sarah felt her stomach tighten. These were precisely the areas where her classified background provided expertise that exceeded anything available among Blackstone's current instructor staff. But Director Hawthorne had limited her role to specialized consultation rather than primary instruction. "Where's the evaluation taking place?" "Main conference room." Hawthorne and Walsh are leading the presentation, but the Meridian team is asking increasingly detailed questions about operational scenarios that our standard curriculum doesn't address. Sarah gathered her materials and headed toward the main building, understanding that the next few hours would likely determine whether Blackstone secured the most important contract in their history or lost it due to inadequate demonstration of capabilities. Outside the conference room, she could hear Director Hawthorne's voice becoming increasingly strained as he attempted to address questions that exceeded his operational experience. Through the partially open door, she observed the Meridian delegation, 3 men and 1 woman, all carrying themselves with the relaxed confidence that marked experienced operators. The woman, who appeared to be the senior representative, was asking about stress inoculation training for personnel operating in politically sensitive environments. "Our teams need to function effectively when standard protocols break down and they're operating beyond conventional support structures. How do you prepare students for decision-making under those conditions?" Hawthorne's response was textbook perfect but operationally inadequate. "Our stress inoculation protocols include sleep deprivation, time pressure, and complex scenario development designed to test decision-making capabilities under adverse conditions." "That's conventional training," replied one of the male delegates, a compact man with visible scarring on his hands that suggested extensive operational experience. "We need personnel who can adapt when their training scenarios don't match operational realities. When communication fails, when equipment breaks down, when local support disappears." Sarah recognized the gap immediately. Conventional stress training prepared students for known variables and anticipated challenges. Real operational environments included unknown variables and unanticipated challenges that required adaptability beyond standard training protocols. Assistant Director Walsh attempted to bridge the gap. "Our advanced programs include scenario variations designed to test adaptability and creative problem solving. Can you demonstrate that?" asked the senior female delegate. "Because our experience with academy-trained personnel suggests that most programs focus on procedural compliance rather than adaptive thinking." The challenge was direct and potentially devastating. Meridian was essentially asking Blackstone to prove that their training produced operationally capable personnel rather than procedurally competent students. Sarah made a decision that would alter her career trajectory permanently. She knocked on the conference room door and entered when Hawthorne acknowledged her. "Sir, I believe I can address the specific training questions that the Meridian delegation is asking." Hawthorne's expression showed a mixture of relief and concern. He needed Sarah's expertise, but worried about the implications of revealing that his most qualified instructor had been systematically excluded from program development. "Instructor Mitchell has recently been integrated into our Meridian program development team," he said diplomatically. "She brings specialized experience in the operational areas that you're discussing." The senior Meridian delegate studied Sarah carefully. "What kind of specialized experience?" "Joint Special Operations Command. Assignments focusing on personnel and equipment coordination for operations in contested environments. Sarah replied directly. 7 years of operational experience in environments where conventional protocols were insufficient and adaptive thinking was essential for mission success. The transformation in the room's atmosphere was immediate. The Meridian delegates straightened with obvious interest, recognizing qualifications that matched their operational requirements. "Can you be more specific about the type of operations?" asked the scarred delegate. "Executive protection in politically unstable regions. Logistics coordination for teams operating beyond conventional resupply. Integration with foreign military and intelligence services. And stress management for personnel facing extended deployment in hostile environments." The female delegate leaned forward. "That's precisely what we need. Can you demonstrate your training methodology?" Sarah glanced at Hawthorne, who nodded reluctantly. He desperately needed this contract but was uncomfortable with the demonstration that Sarah's capabilities exceeded those of his primary instructor's staff. "I'd be happy to demonstrate our adaptive training approach," Sarah replied. "Could you provide a specific operational scenario that your teams typically encounter?" The delegates exchanged glances before the female representative responded. "High-value individual protection in an urban environment where local security forces are unreliable. Communication with home base is intermittent, and the threat environment changes rapidly." Sarah nodded. "That's an excellent scenario for demonstrating adaptive training methodology. The key is preparing students for decision-making when their standard operating procedures don't apply to the specific conditions they encounter." She moved to the whiteboard and began outlining a training progression that started with conventional protective protocols and systematically introduced variables that would force students to adapt their approaches in real time. Traditional training teaches students to establish security perimeters, coordinate with local authorities, and maintain communication with support elements, she explained while drawing tactical diagrams. But operational reality often includes compromised local authorities, unreliable communication, and threat environments that exceed conventional response capabilities. As she developed the training scenario, Sarah drew on operational experience that exceeded anything available in conventional training programs. Her methodology incorporated techniques for rapid threat assessment, improvised logistics coordination, and stress management that came from surviving situations where textbook approaches had proven inadequate. "The critical element," she continued, "is teaching students to recognize when their standard procedures are insufficient and transition to adaptive approaches that address actual conditions rather than anticipated conditions." The Meridian delegates were taking detailed notes, obviously impressed by training concepts that addressed real-world challenges they'd encountered during operational deployments. "This is exactly what we need," the senior delegate said. "Most academy training prepares students for ideal conditions that rarely exist in operational environments. Your approach addresses the gap between classroom theory and operational reality." Hawthorne looked relieved but uncomfortable. Sarah's demonstration was securing the contract, but also highlighting the inadequacy of his conventional training approaches. "Could you develop this training methodology for our specific operational requirements?" asked another delegate. "Absolutely. The adaptive training approach can be customized for any operational environment or threat scenario. The key is understanding the specific challenges that your teams encounter and developing training progressions that prepare them for those realities." The presentation continued for another hour, with Sarah demonstrating training concepts that none of Blackstone's other instructors could have developed. Her expertise in logistics coordination, stress management, and adaptive tactical thinking provided exactly the capabilities that Meridian's contract required. When the evaluation session ended, the lead Meridian delegate addressed Director Hawthorne directly. "We're prepared to award this contract to Blackstone Academy, but we have specific requirements for instructor qualifications." Hawthorne waited apprehensively for conditions that might prove difficult to meet. We want Instructor Mitchell as the lead program developer and primary tactical instructor for this contract. Her qualifications match our operational requirements exactly. The request created immediate tension. Elevating Sarah to lead instructor status would require acknowledging that she was more qualified than the instructors who had been originally designated for the program. That arrangement would be possible, Hawthorne replied carefully. It's not optional, the delegate clarified. Our contract approval is contingent on Instructor Mitchell's primary involvement in program development and instruction. We've worked with too many academies where qualified personnel are underutilized due to administrative considerations. Sarah recognized the moment when her career trajectory shifted permanently. The Meridian contract was contingent on her leadership role, giving her leverage that transcended normal institutional hierarchies. I'm committed to developing the most effective training program possible for your operational requirements, she told the delegates. My goal is ensuring that your personnel receive preparation that directly addresses the challenges they'll encounter in real-world environments. After the Meridian delegation departed, Director Hawthorne found himself in an unprecedented situation. His most important contract was contingent on elevating an instructor whose capabilities he'd systematically underestimated for 3 years. Sarah, he said when they were alone in the conference room, I owe you an apology. It's clear that we haven't properly utilized your qualifications. Sir, my primary concern is program effectiveness. If we can develop training that better prepares students for operational realities, that's what matters most. The Meridian contract will require significant changes to our training methodology. Are you prepared to lead that kind of program development? Sarah met his gaze directly. I've been prepared for 3 years. The question is whether the Academy is ready to implement training approaches that challenge conventional methodologies. That afternoon, Sarah received a congratulatory message from Colonel Hayes. Heard about your contract demonstration. Impressive. Performance under pressure. Alternative opportunities remain available if institutional support proves inadequate. The message reminded Sarah that her success with the Meridian evaluation had created options beyond remaining at Blackstone. She could now choose between leading program development at an academy that had systematically undervalued her contributions, or transitioning to organizations that had actively sought her qualifications. But as she reviewed the training requirements that Meridian had specified, Sarah recognized an opportunity to implement the kind of comprehensive program development that she'd been advocating for years. The contract provided both the authority and the resources to create training that would genuinely prepare students for operational challenges that conventional programs ignored. That evening, technical instructor Vasquez found her in the training area, conducting equipment assessments for the specialized gear that the Meridian program would require. Sarah, I heard that you're being elevated to lead instructor for the biggest contract in Academy history. Congratulations. Thanks, Amanda. It's going to be challenging to develop training that meets their operational requirements. Are you staying at Blackstone, or are there other opportunities you're considering? Sarah considered the question carefully. That depends on whether the Academy is genuinely committed to program improvement, or just trying to secure this contract without making broader changes. What would convince you to stay? Systematic support for training methodologies that prioritize student preparation over administrative convenience. The Meridian contract is just the beginning. There are improvements that could benefit all our programs. Vasquez nodded understanding. You're not just talking about one contract. You're talking about changing how the Academy approaches tactical training entirely. Exactly. The question is whether institutional leadership is ready for that kind of change. Over the next few days, Sarah would discover whether her demonstration with the Meridian delegation had created genuine opportunity for program improvement or simply provided temporary leverage that would diminish once the contract was secured. The careful concealment that had defined her civilian career was permanently ended. Her capabilities were now validated by external recognition that transcended internal academy politics, and her future would be determined by how effectively those capabilities could be employed, rather than how successfully they could be hidden. 6 months after the Phoenix Contract Award, Sarah stood before the most diverse group of students in Blackstone Academy's history. But this time something was different. For the first time in 3 years, she wore short sleeves. The intricate tattoo work covering her arms was finally visible, the Ranger tab filled with classified coordinates, the JSOC lightning bolt surrounded by call signs of fallen operators, and the small trident that marked her as one of fewer than 10 women to complete the most elite training pipeline in military history. The transformation had been as dramatic as it was necessary. Director Hawthorne, confronted with the choice between adapting to Sarah's methodologies or losing the most lucrative contract in Academy history, had chosen complete institutional restructuring. The Phoenix program she'd developed had attracted participants from elite protection services, corporate security divisions, and government agencies across 4 continents. Word had spread through professional networks that Blackstone was offering tactical training that bridged the gap between academic theory and operational reality. Sarah's elevation to senior training director had been accompanied by unprecedented authority to redesign curriculum standards, instructor qualifications, and assessment protocols throughout the academy. The position represented vindication for 3 years of systematic underutilization, but more importantly, it provided the platform to implement training improvements that would directly impact operator safety and mission effectiveness in hostile environments worldwide. Today we begin what I call reality-based tactical adaptation, Sarah announced to her class of 32 students, her visible tattoos serving as immediate credibility markers that no academic credentials could match. Everything you've learned in conventional programs has prepared you for ideal conditions that exist primarily in training environments. This program will prepare you for the operational reality that your textbook knowledge will often be insufficient when conditions change without warning. Among her students sat former military personnel, experienced law enforcement officers, and private security specialists who had encountered the limitations of conventional training during real-world operations. Their faces showed the mixture of skepticism and hope that characterized operators who had been disappointed by previous training programs but remained committed to professional development that could save their lives. The training methodology Sarah had developed drew extensively on her classified operational experience, while remaining within security parameters that protected sensitive information. Students learned to recognize when standard operating procedures were inadequate, develop adaptive responses to unexpected challenges, and maintain operational effectiveness when support systems failed completely. But the most powerful moment came during the 3rd week of training when a former Marine student approached her after a particularly challenging scenario exercise. "Ma'am, I have to ask about your ink, that trident. I've only seen that on a few operators, and they were all legends in the community." Sarah paused, understanding that this was the moment she'd been preparing for since her first day at Blackstone. For 3 years, she'd hidden her qualifications to maintain operational security and avoid complications that could compromise ongoing missions. Now, with appropriate authorization and the passage of time, she could finally acknowledge the capabilities that her tattoos represented. That trident represents 7 years in units that don't officially exist, conducting operations in places that aren't on any map, she said quietly. The coordinates around my Ranger tab mark locations where conventional tactics would have gotten my team killed. Every piece of ink on my arms tells a story about why the training you're receiving here could save your life when everything else fails. The revelation rippled through the academy community like wildfire. Students who had questioned whether their instructor truly understood operational stress realized They were learning from someone who had survived situations that exceeded their worst nightmares. Instructors who had dismissed her suggestions for 3 years suddenly understood that they'd been working alongside one of the most qualified special operations veterans in the industry. Master Instructor Rivera, who had supported Sarah consistently during her marginalization, now served as her deputy program director. His loyalty had been rewarded with opportunities to learn advanced training techniques that enhanced his own professional capabilities beyond anything he'd imagined possible. Sarah's approach isn't just revolutionary, Rivera explained to visiting academy directors from other institutions. It's necessary. We were training students to follow procedures regardless of conditions. She teaches them to assess conditions and adapt procedures accordingly. It's the difference between creating followers and creating survivors. The impact extended far beyond individual student performance. Agencies that sent personnel through Sarah's programs reported significant improvements in operational effectiveness, particularly in challenging environments where conventional training had proven inadequate. Corporate security divisions noted enhanced threat assessment capabilities. Executive protection teams demonstrated improved adaptability under pressure, and government agencies recognized measurable improvements in mission success rates. The transformation hadn't been without institutional casualties. Assistant Director Walsh, whose federal law enforcement background made her uncomfortable with training approaches that emphasized adaptive thinking over procedural compliance, had requested transfer to another academy where conventional methodologies remained dominant. Her departure had been professionally handled, but represented acknowledgement that some personnel couldn't adapt to training philosophies that challenged their fundamental assumptions. Several veteran instructors had struggled to integrate methodologies that challenged their established approaches. Senior Instructor Reynolds, who had originally been designated as lead instructor for the Phoenix program, found himself relegated to conventional training tracks as his limitations became apparent when compared to Sarah's operational expertise. The most significant resistance had come from competing academies whose conventional approaches were being overshadowed by Blackstone's enhanced reputation. Industry publications had begun featuring articles about Sarah's innovative training methodology, describing her as a transformative figure who was revolutionizing tactical training throughout the private security industry. The recognition culminated 6 months later when Sarah received an invitation to deliver the keynote address at the International Association of Security Training Professionals annual conference. Standing before an audience of academy directors and senior instructors from around the world, she delivered a presentation that would influence security training methodology for years to come. Traditional training programs prepare students for average conditions, she explained to the assembled professionals, her visible tattoos serving as constant reminder of her credentials. But operational personnel don't encounter average conditions. They encounter specific conditions that require adaptive responses based on actual circumstances rather than anticipated scenarios. In the audience sat Director Hawthorne and Board Member Chambers, both of whom had traveled to support Sarah's presentation and promote Blackstone's enhanced reputation within the professional community. The transformation in their institutional relationship represented more than personal vindication. It demonstrated that excellence could overcome institutional bias when supported by demonstrated effectiveness. The changes at Blackstone Academy represent more than curriculum improvement. Sarah continued. They represent a fundamental shift in how we prepare personnel for operational challenges that can't be addressed through conventional training approaches that prioritize procedural compliance over operational effectiveness. After her presentation, Sarah was approached by academy directors from 3 continents, all requesting consultation services for developing adaptive training programs within their own institutions. The demand demonstrated that her methodology addressed widespread limitations in conventional security training that extended far beyond Blackstone's previous approaches. but the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. Technical. Instructor Vasquez, who had initially been assigned to investigate Sarah's background inconsistencies, approached her after the conference. "Sarah, I need to tell you something. When Hawthorne asked me to document inconsistencies in your background, I was prepared to find evidence of credential fraud. Instead, I discovered someone whose qualifications far exceeded anything reflected. Inaccessible records. Your success represents vindication not just for you, but for every qualified person who's been underestimated due to incomplete information." 3 months later, Sarah received a letter that would become one of her most treasured possessions. A former Phoenix student who had completed her advanced tactical adaptation program had successfully managed a crisis situation in Eastern Europe where conventional protocols would have failed catastrophically. "Your training saved my principles. Life and probably mine as well," he wrote. "When everything went wrong and none of our standard procedures applied, I was able to adapt because you'd taught me to think beyond textbook solutions." The coordinates tattooed on your arm represent places where you learned these lessons. Now those lessons are protecting people who will never know how close they came to disaster. Similar testimonials arrived regularly from personnel who had completed Sarah's programs and encountered operational challenges that required adaptive responses. Each letter reinforced her conviction that effective training must prepare students for reality rather than idealized conditions that existed primarily in controlled environments. 1 year after her background verification, Sarah received a final communication from Colonel Hayes that provided closure on her transition from classified operations to civilian training applications. "Your civilian training programs are generating attention throughout the military special operations community," Hayes wrote. "The methodology you've developed is being studied for potential integration into military instruction. You've achieved something remarkable, creating training that enhances operational effectiveness across diverse environments and applications, while maintaining the security protocols that protect ongoing operations." The message represented validation that her careful transition from classified military service to civilian training applications had succeeded beyond her original expectations. The concealment that had protected operational security had ultimately led to opportunities for broader impact than direct application of her military experience could have achieved. At Blackstone Academy, Sarah's office wall displayed photographs from graduation ceremonies representing hundreds of students who had completed programs that prepared them for operational realities rather than academic ideals. Each photograph represented personnel whose enhanced capabilities would contribute to mission success and personal safety in challenging environments around the world. But the most significant change was visible every day in the Academy's training areas where students received instruction that reflected operational realities rather than administrative convenience. The tattoos on Sarah's arms no longer represented dangerous secrets that could compromise her position. They served as visible proof that the training they were receiving came from someone who had survived the challenges they might face. Transformation from dismissed equipment coordinator to industry-leading training director demonstrated that excellence could overcome institutional resistance when supported by demonstrated effectiveness. More importantly, it proved that individual success could create systematic change that benefited others. Facing similar challenges throughout the security training industry, Sarah's legacy extended beyond personal vindication to institutional transformation that would influence security training methodology for years to come, ensuring that future personnel would receive preparation that reflected operational realities rather than the limitations of instructors who had never faced the challenges their students would encounter. The story of the woman who hid her special operations tattoos had become an inspiration throughout the security training community, proving that true qualifications couldn't remain hidden forever and that Institutional bias could be overcome through demonstrated competence that exceeded all assumptions. As Sarah stood in her office, looking out at students conducting training exercises that incorporated methodology she developed from real-world experience, she finally understood that her 3 years of concealment had served a purpose beyond protecting classified operations. They had prepared her to revolutionize an entire industry by proving that the most powerful weapon against institutional bias was undeniable excellence that spoke louder than any credential or position title. If you've been inspired by Sarah's journey from hidden operator to transformative leader, subscribe to our channel for more stories of extraordinary courage and perseverance. We explore the remarkable true stories of people who overcame impossible odds through determination, skill, and the courage to reveal their true capabilities when it mattered most. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our global community of viewers who find inspiration in these incredible stories of triumph over institutional barriers and the power of persistence in the face of systematic underestimation. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying this story, please consider subscribing to our channel.